Dinosaurs have long captured our imagination. But did you know one of the most famous names in paleontology was once declared extinct, not from nature, but from science itself? The name of Brontosaurus, the thunder lizard, has recently roared back into scientific debate after more than a century in obscurity. The story of Brontosaurus begins in the late 19th century, during a very strange period of fossil hunting, this known as the Bone Wars. The Bone Wars was a rivalry between paleontologists Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope. These two scientists were in a race to discover and name as many prehistoric species as possible. And this wasn't just a friendly competition. They were frantically on the search to identify new species of dinosaurs before the other, often leading to hasty and sometimes incorrect classifications. Their careers started out rather friendly, with Marsh and Cope swapping letters, fossils and manuscripts. They even named a couple of new species after each other. Cope named an amphibian fossil Pteonius marshi, with Marsh returning the favour, naming a giant marine creature Mosasaurus copianus. Marsh, however, was already betraying Cope even in these friendly stages. It turns out the Mosasaurus copianus fossil that Marsh had lovingly named after Cope came from a quarry that Cope was working in. He had shown Marsh the site in 1868, and quick-thinking Marsh struck a deal with quarry owners to ignore Cope and bring any new fossils they found to him instead. This resulted in him finding the namesake fossil, much to Cope's anger. To add to his misery, Cope then got publicly embarrassed after putting an Elasmosaurus skull on the wrong end of a fossil that he was reconstructing. Marsh eagerly pointed out this mistake, which Cope argued, but a third party confirmed Marsh was correct. In a desperate attempt to save his reputation, Cope tried to buy back all copies of his publication to stop the spread of his embarrassingly inaccurate findings. He succeeded mostly, except for a few copies, including one that Marsh kept, of course. And so the Bone Wars began, the two paleontologists competing head-to-head to identify more species than the other. So what about Brontosaurus? Over a decade later, in 1879, Marsh hit the jackpot. He discovered a new, massive sauropod species, a 22-meter fossil excavated by Marsh's fieldworker William Harlow Reed from the Como Bluff site in Wyoming. This area was part of the famous Morrison Formation, a late Jurassic geological deposit. The holotype specimen of the fossil, now catalogued as YPM 1980 at the Yale Peabody Museum, consisted of a nearly complete skeleton. This was one of the most intact sauropod skeletons ever found at the time, including cervical vertebrae, ribs, and limb bones. The fossils revealed a massive, quadrupedal dinosaur with a long neck, a whip-like tail, and a large barrel-shaped body. Although the body was largely complete, no skull was found with the initial specimen. This would turn out to be Marsh's downfall. Marsh and his colleagues began theorizing about the lifestyle and ecology of the massive new species they had just discovered, naming it Brontosaurus excelsus, stemming from the Greek bronte for thunder and saurus for lizard, combined with the Latin excelsus for high or noble. This gave rise to the noble thunder lizard. Marsh already believed from previous discoveries that sauropods like Brontosaurus were too massive to fully support their weight on land. This led to the popular theory that Brontosaurus was a semi-aquatic animal that spent much of its time in water, such as lakes, rivers, or swamps, to take some of the weight off of its legs. The massive body size and long tail were thought to assist with buoyancy in water. Marsh and his contemporaries also speculated that the nostrils, located near the top of the head, were adaptations for breathing while submerged. This was, of course, based on information from the skull, which we will find out to be a major issue later in the video. And if you're enjoying this video so far, please click like to let us know and consider subscribing. We'd love to have you join us on future journeys. Back to Brontosaurus. From more recent evidence, we know that Brontosaurus was in fact terrestrial. Its columnar legs and robust pelvic structure distributed its immense weight very efficiently, allowing it to walk with a slow, steady gait, averaging speeds of around 5 kilometers per hour or 3 miles per hour. The whip-like tail, often depicted as a defensive weapon, might have served multiple purposes, including balance during movement or as a sensory tool to detect predators. Not so much for buoyancy. The biggest faux pas, however, comes down to the skull. While the fossil skeleton he studied was remarkably complete for its time, as we've mentioned, it lacked the skull, a very critical element. To reconstruct what the dinosaur might have looked like, Marsh turned to other fossil material from nearby sites in the Morrison Formation. Unfortunately, his choice would lead to a century of scientific confusion. Marsh realized the skull was missing, but looking at the rest of the fossil, he decided that the biggest, bulkiest animal ever discovered needed a big, bulky head. Therefore, he modeled the skull of a Camarasaurus. The Camarasaurus had a broad, boxy skull with a short snout. The snout had nasal openings near the top of the skull, and it had spoon-shaped teeth for grinding tough vegetation. Brontosaurus, on the other hand, has a more long and slender head like a diplodocus. Its nasal passages are positioned further back and higher on the skull, and it had peg-like teeth for stripping leaves rather than heavy chewing. The uncertainties in this fossil's ecology, and particularly its final form, left the door open for criticisms, and Elmer Riggs stepped through that door. What lay in store for the Marsh and his Brontosaurus discovery? In 1903, another paleontologist by the name of Elmer Riggs was analyzing Marsh's finds. A few years prior to finding the Brontosaurus, Marsh had found a small Apatosaurus. Riggs realized that this particular specimen was a juvenile and concluded that the Brontosaurus Marsh had found was actually just a large Apatosaurus. Deciding that the Apatosaurus ajax and Brontosaurus excelsus fossils were similar enough, Riggs proposed that they get the same genus name. He did decide, however, that they were not close enough to be the same species. He reassigned them, so we have Apatosaurus ajax and Apatosaurus excelsus. While this was still a new species that Marsh could add to his list in the bone wars against Cope, it certainly hurt his morale having his findings scrutinized so heavily in the public eye. Despite this decision, most museums where the fossil was on show, including being the first mounted sauropod skeleton displayed, which featured in the American Museum of Natural History, the fossil was referred to as Brontosaurus excelsus, leading to its frequent yet theoretically incorrect usage for over a century. So if Brontosaurus was your favorite dinosaur as a kid, or up until 2015 for that matter, you were sadly favoring a non-existent dinosaur. Missing parts of the exhibit, such as the feet and sections of the tail, were supplemented with bones from other dinosaurs, and the sculpted skull, based on the blunt-nosed Camarasaurus we mentioned earlier, was placed on the mount. The inaccurate skull would perpetuate misconceptions about the dinosaur's true appearance. But in steps modern-day science. After more than a century of controversy, a comprehensive study led by Emmanuel Chopp re-examined hundreds of sauropod fossils using computer analysis. This provided more standardized comparisons of hundreds of parameters, including comparisons of Apatosaurus ajax and Apatosaurus excelsus. Chopp and his team came to an interesting conclusion. If you're a Brontosaurus fan and you'd like the good news, go below this video and hit the like button on my count. Ready? 1, 2, 3. And Chopp and his team found that there were enough differences between the two samples to confirm they were different species, but also enough differences to suggest that they shouldn't even be in the same genus. Apatosaurus ajax is a lot bigger, and its neck angle is different. There are a lot of different bumps on the bones that don't quite line up. This meant the two were closely related, like lions and cheetahs, but not close enough to be in the same genus like lions and tigers. Thus, in 2015, the genus Brontosaurus was brought back to life. While the validity of this conclusion is still debated, it certainly fills a hole in my inner child's heart to know my favorite dinosaur is actually real. And what about Marsh? He would be ecstatic to hear this news. Do you think this means he has officially won the Bone Wars? In numbers, Marsh identified 80 confirmed species versus Cope's 56, so technically Marsh did win. Comment down below to let us know what you think. This doesn't stop his other errors from standing, though, rushed in haste to beat his rival. Although many of these errors were corrected in time, and also stood next to some honorable discoveries, such as those of the well-loved Stegosaurus, Triceratops, Allosaurus, Diplodocus, and of course, Brontosaurus. Thanks for watching. See you next time.